On July 7, 1929, a ceremony occurred at New York's Pennsylvania Station. Across the country in Los Angeles, Charles Lindbergh, the pilot who had captured the attention of America and the world 2 years earlier by flying the Atlantic non-stop in the spirit of St. Louis, pressed a button that rang a bell in Pennsylvania Station to signal the departure of a train called the Airway Limited, which began moving, heading west toward Columbus, Ohio. The ceremony was covered live on radio. Telegrams with congratulatory messages flooded into the station, including one from New York's governor, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The departure of the Airway Limited train was a big deal because it was the inauguration of a daring new venture called Transcontinental Air Transport, a company that had proposed a service utilizing trains and airplanes to carry paying passengers from coast to coast in 48 hours. That had never been done before. It was the aircraft angle that interested the public. At 7:55 the next morning, passengers of the Airway Limited got off the train at Columbus and walked a short distance to two airplanes, Ford trimotors named City of Columbus and City of Wichita. The planes took off at 8:15 a.m. With stops in various places, including Indianapolis, St. Louis, Kansas City, and Wichita. The passengers spent all day in the air before they were delivered to sleeper train cars at Clovis, New Mexico, for the next land-based overnight round of the voyage. The westbound passengers on the inaugural TAT arrived shortly before 6 p.m. the next day at Glendale Airport in Southern California. On July 9th, the first eastbound flight, with Lindbergh himself at the controls, took off. Both expeditions, eastbound and westbound, were highly successful and widely covered in the press. For the sum of $352, about $6,700 in today's money, Americans could theoretically travel from coast to coast in less than 48 hours' time. Transcontinental Air Transport was a big deal, not just because of the stunt value that made headlines. It was one of the companies that, after a merger the following year, would become part of a legacy that would stretch over the next 7 decades and become one of the most recognizable icons of the golden age of aviation, TWA. That acronym stood for more than one thing over the course of its history, but it's most fondly remembered as Trans World Airlines. With the exception of Pan American Airways, TWA, Pan Am's arch-rival in many important respects, is probably the most famous of the legacy U.S. airlines that don't exist anymore. Instantly recognizable by its distinctive red and white planes, TWA was a formidable presence at airports and in the skies, not just over the United States, but in Europe, the Middle East, and various other parts of the world. The TWA story involves larger-than-life personalities like Howard Hughes, the mentally ill billionaire who built the world's largest plane, and also Wall Street raider Carl Icahn, one of the models for the character of Gordon Gekko in Oliver Stone's film Wall Street. Plenty of tragedy is also associated with the TWA story. In the 1970s and 80s, TWA had the reputation of being terrorists' airline of choice, with high-profile incidents like the hijacking of TWA Flight 847 in 1985, which was tangentially a part of the story of the Iran-Contra affair. And there was TWA Flight 800, the heartbreaking disaster over Long Island in 1996, one of the major milestones on TWA's long decline to its eventual dissolution 5 years later. Indeed, for almost every significant step forward in the TWA story, there seems to be a step backward. Only 2 months after the successful inauguration of Transcontinental Air Transport, on September 3, 1929, a TAT Ford trimotor plane called the City of San Francisco, flying from Albuquerque to Winslow, Arizona, vanished en route during a bout of heavy weather. 4 days later, the wreckage of the plane was found on the slopes of Mount Taylor, west of Albuquerque. None of the 8 people on board survived. These two events in the summer of 1929, the launch of Transcontinental Air Transport and the City of San Francisco crash, are a metaphor reflecting the whole TWA story. It's full of pioneering firsts and great triumphs, but for every way in which TWA pushed aviation history forward, there was also something that held it back. TWA was a great and memorable airline, and also in many ways a boondoggle and a disaster. It's a complicated subject, but I'm going to try to do it justice here. This is the story of TWA, the rise and fall. Hi, I'm Sean Munger, historian, and welcome back to my channel. I have a PhD in history, and I'm known here for doing long, intensive, deep dive videos on various historical subjects. Back in June 2024, I did a video called The Rise and Fall of Pan Am. It's one of the most successful videos on my channel. Even when doing that project, I hoped eventually to make another video about Trans World Airlines, which in some ways was Pan Am's rival and opposite number, and which is also fondly remembered in aviation history. I was surprised, though, when I got into the history of TWA, how different it really was from Pan Am. While it follows some of the same contours, reflecting the broader story as a whole of the American and world commercial aviation industries, TWA's story is unique unto itself. I think that's in part because the airline was dominated for a significant part of its existence by individual personalities, Howard Hughes and Carl Icahn chief among them, but by no means the only ones. So this is a story as much about people as it is about airplanes. In a moment, we'll get into it and pick up the story of how Transcontinental Air Transport and a totally different airline called Western Air Express eventually became TWA. I want to mention, though, as some of you may know, that this channel has a members section where you can watch a version of this video without ads or redactions that I occasionally have to do to satisfy ad-friendly guidelines. It's only $5 a month to join the members section, and I really do appreciate the support. The sources I used to make this video are listed in credits at the end and also in the description below. In marked contrast to the many books that have been written on Pan Am, I was surprised to discover that there is to date only one comprehensive book-length history of TWA out there, Come Fly With Me by Daniel Rust and Alan Hoffman, published in 2023. It's a great book, and I highly recommend it if you want to know even more about the TWA story. TWA was a pioneering airline that was cutting edge in the 1920s and early 30s, but which eventually lost its innovative capacities and ultimately fell behind. It barely survived into the internet era. You're looking at what TWA's website looked like in 1997, and it's pretty pitiful even by 1997 standards. I mean, my old GeoCities website looked better than this. But even the internet as it existed 29 years ago, which was a little too advanced for TWA's capabilities, was a far simpler and more straightforward place than it is today in 2026. One of the challenges we face now that was unimaginable in 1997 was online privacy and security. Recently, I've become significantly more concerned about online privacy than I ever have been before. And that's one reason why I use a VPN, and specifically private internet access, which I think is a VPN service that really stands out. VPN stands for Virtual Private Network, and I'm sure you've heard of it. This is an app that hides your IP address and safeguards your internet connection through basically an encrypted tunnel. It's especially good if you're connecting on a public Wi-Fi network, such as an airport. Do not trust airport Wi-Fi, even at St. Louis, TWA's old hub. One thing I really like about private internet access is that it has a strict no logs policy. That means they don't record or store user data. That's not just sales puffery. Private internet access has had this policy vetted in court and also by third-party auditors. That's what really sold me on them. You can get private internet access for all platforms, Windows, Mac, Android, whatever, and you can use it on an unlimited number of devices at the same time. An added benefit, while using the VPN, you can access streaming services, websites, and content unavailable in various countries by giving you the option to change your IP address to any one of 91 countries. In this video, I'm going to reference the 2004 Martin Scorsese film The Aviator several times. This film is a biopic of Howard Hughes, who was heavily involved in TWA in its middle decades. Incredibly, if you have Netflix, The Aviator is not available in the United States. You can watch it in Uganda or on the Channel Island of Guernsey, but not the United States. And if you don't have Netflix but only Paramount Plus, the only country it's available in at all is Canada. But with a VPN, you can change your apparent country of origin to whatever it needs to be, so you can see it no problem. If you go to this link, piavpn.com/SeanMunger, you can get 83% off, which comes out to $2.03 a month, a huge savings, and you get 4 months free. Go to the link, or you can just scan the QR code on the screen there. Private internet access can help you stay safe in the treacherous world of today's internet. My thanks to them for sponsoring this video. Now, let's return to the story of Transcontinental Air Transport and how it eventually became TWA. When Transcontinental Air Transport began flying in 1929, at the dawn of the commercial aviation age, transporting paying passengers by air was little more than a side hustle. It was not the primary mission of early airlines. The whole reason airlines were invented in America in the 1920s was not to transport people, but mail. Contracts to fly mail awarded by the U.S. Post Office were the very basis of every early airline in America. So with TWA's story, we have to start with mail. The post office began experimenting with airmail as early as 1911, but it didn't take off, no pun intended, until after World War I, when the development of combat and reconnaissance aircraft and a pool of pilots to fly them existed in sufficient supply. Even before the war was over, the post office was planning a transcontinental airmail service, which it actually inaugurated in 1920. Railroads were alarmed by this development. Previously, they had carried most of the country's mail, and they lobbied Congress to set up a system to award airmail service contracts to private companies. In 1925, two prominent Los Angeles businessmen, Harry Chandler, owner of the Los Angeles Times, and James Talbot, an oil magnate, founded Western Air Express. While they did anticipate carrying passengers, mail was still the name of the game. WAE's first flight took off in April 1926, carrying only mail. Passengers were eventually let in on the fun, one passenger to a plane, Douglas M2s in those days, and they had to sit on bags of mail. Another significant early airline was Standard Airlines, a subsidiary of Aero Corporation, which operated a flying school and also intended to be a dealership for new planes being introduced by German manufacturer Fokker. One of the 3 LA pilots who went in on Standard Airlines was Jack Fry, who would become president of TWA. A man called Jack Maddox, a car dealer in LA with a hankering for flying and money to burn, formed Maddox Airlines mainly to give scenic rides to businessmen and rich people. Even though the Ford Trimotor, which first appeared in 1926, could be considered the Rolls-Royce of airliners, spending all day in one was a punishing experience. It was cold, not just because heating a passenger cabin was impractical, but the plane's skin was made of corrugated aluminum. Airliners in the late 1920s typically flew at an altitude of about 5,000 feet. There's a lot of turbulence at that altitude, and pilots were constantly running into weather problems, like the thunderstorm that took out TAT's plane City of San Francisco in September 1929. By the end of the 20s, although airlines were becoming a going concern, heavily subsidized by federal airmail contracts, it was clear there was still a lot more development in terms of aircraft, infrastructure, routes, and passenger expectations that needed to be done before airlines could reach critical mass in terms of economic viability. TAT, in fact, lost money, $2.75 million, in its 18-month existence. In short order, economic viability for airlines became even harder. In October 1929, the U.S. stock market crashed. Historians usually talk about the 1929 crash as if it instantaneously sparked the Great Depression. In reality, it took a couple of months for the scale of the economic disaster to sink in. The deepening crisis made the economic futures of air operations even more perilous, which led to a number of mergers and reorganizations. In November 1929, TAT bought Maddox Airlines, which by then had graduated from basically an air ride service to a real airline carrying passengers, mostly to and from airports in Southern California. But something else was afoot. Walter Folger Brown, appointed U.S. Postmaster General by the new President Herbert Hoover, saw the awarding of airmail contracts as a significant tool in molding the basis of a commercial aviation industry in the United States. Brown awarded new contracts and reorganized existing ones, usually insisting on significant conditions as a result of the contracts. Brown suggested a merger between TAT and Western Air Express, and also a smaller company just formed, Pittsburgh Aviation Industries Corporation, which was backed by money from the powerful Mellon family. The TAT and Western Air Express merger, which officially happened on July 24, 1930, created a new company, Transcontinental and Western Air, Inc. Kansas City would eventually be selected as its base of operations. Incidentally, Brown's shenanigans with conditions and contracts not only formed TWA in this period, but also American Airlines, United Airlines, and Eastern Air Transport, which later became Eastern Airlines. Together, these were the big four that would shape the future of air travel and the whole aviation sector in the United States. I have to stress that this was different than what was going on with Pan American. Pan Am, formed in 1927, was always envisioned as an overseas carrier, not a hauler of mail or passengers within the United States. The air industry was too new for any sort of synergy to exist between domestic airlines and international airlines. Before we go farther, we need to do a little bit more context. Here's where we're at right now. It's mid-1930, early Great Depression, and TWA has just been formed by the merger of TAT and Western Air Express. Hold this thought, because this is a story as much about people as about airlines or planes. I want to go back and fill in some of the gaps about the personalities who were instrumental in the early days of TWA, or in the case of Howard Hughes, in the future development of TWA. The stories of these key people are in the next chapter. Aviation was a very young industry. Of the three men who were critical in the early history of TWA, only one, Charles Lindbergh, was born before the Wright brothers made their historic flight in North Carolina in 1903, and he was not yet 2 years old when that happened. Charles Augustus Lindbergh came from a relatively well-to-do family, though not old money. His father had been born in Sweden, but the family immigrated to the United States when the elder Lindbergh was a baby. By the time of his son Charles's birth in February 1902, the elder Lindbergh was a successful district attorney with contacts in politics, and indeed he would serve as U.S. Congressman from Minnesota's 6th District from 1907 to 1917. Among the various schools Charles Lindbergh attended was Sidwell Friends School in Washington, D.C., which also educated the daughters of Richard Nixon, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama. He attended the University of Wisconsin briefly, but dropped out. Too young to have learned to fly in the Army during World War I, as many 1920s aviators did, Lindbergh took his first ride in a plane in Lincoln, Nebraska in 1922. This was the barnstorming era when aviation stunts were very popular with the public, and Lindbergh got a lot of his early flying experience doing that sort of thing. He was also an airmail pilot. But of course, Lindbergh's big claim to fame, and the pedestal on which he and the rest of America built his oversized reputation as hero of the ages, was his try for the Orteig Prize, a $25,000 bounty for the first nonstop flight between New York and Paris. By the time Lindbergh took off on May 20th, 1927, various attempts to win this prize had killed 6 people, including famous aviators Nungesser and Colli, who might actually have made it days earlier, but their plane vanished en route. Pieces of it may have been found in Maine or Newfoundland. Lindbergh's success was as much a result of his skill as an entrepreneur as it was as a pilot. Yes, he did make the flight and won the Orteig Prize, but there was considerable financial as well as aviation engineering that went into creating his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, in which he did it. The press and public on both sides of the Atlantic went absolutely berserk for Lindbergh. He was very successful at parlaying his fame and popularity into measurable business success, such as through his autobiography, We, which sold 650,000 copies in its first year of publication. Lindbergh was 25. I mean, how many 25-year-olds can write best-selling autobiographies of themselves? He also wanted to put some of his publicity magic into an airline, for people as much as mail, that would prove financially successful. That was the genesis of transcontinental air transport. Some of the men who had helped Lindbergh bankroll the construction of the Spirit of St. Louis plane went in with him on this venture. Lindbergh was not CEO of Transcontinental, but rather the head of its technical committee. And as we saw already, he was its public face, piloting one of its inaugural flights. After the merger that created TWA, Lindbergh remained deeply involved with the airline, at least for a while. William John Fry was born in March 1904 in Oklahoma, but his family moved to Wheeler, Texas while he was still a child. He was known as Jack for most of his life. In the last year of World War I, when Jack was 14, 3 U.S. Army planes made an emergency landing near Wheeler due to bad weather, and he got to know their pilots who stayed in town for a while. From that moment on, Jack Fry was fascinated with airplanes and aviation. In the early 1920s, after serving briefly with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Fry went west to Los Angeles. He learned to fly from another barnstormer, Burdett Fuller, a former World War I pilot. He fell in with 2 fellow pilots, Walter Hamilton and Paul Richter, who would also become prominent in TWA in later years. These early flyers followed the usual trajectory of barnstormers to serious aviation businessmen. I told you in the last chapter about how they formed Standard Airlines in 1927. What I didn't tell you is that Standard Airlines, which secured a mail contract and also flew passengers around the U.S. Southwest, was eventually sold by its founders, Fry, Hamilton, and Richter, to Western Air Express. Standard had only been flying for less than 3 years, but the founders needed money due to the Great Depression. WAE, of course, was one of the 2 main airlines that came together to form TWA in July 1930. Just for the record, I know it's confusing. TWA melded together pieces of 5 different airlines. There was Transcontinental Air Transport, Lindbergh's company, Maddox Airlines, which had been merged into TAT, Western Air Express, which had bought Jack Fry's Standard Airlines, and Pittsburgh Aviation Industries Corporation, a small but critical piece of the puzzle, because that's where the Mellon family's money was. Jack Fry was named TWA's vice president in charge of operations. Harris Hanshu, known as Pop, was president, and Paul Richter was head of the Western Division. TWA's first flight departed Newark Airport in New Jersey on October 25, 1930, on a Ford tri-motor plane. This was the first coast-to-coast service to use exclusively airplanes, no train links. Stops included Philadelphia, Harrisburg, Pittsburgh, Columbus, Kansas City, that was an overnight stop, then Wichita, Amarillo, Albuquerque, Winslow, and Kingman, Arizona, then LA. One of the passengers aboard that historic flight was a man named Sid Jaffe, who lived in this house in Brooklyn. Mr. Jaffe has no particular historical significance that I'm aware of, other than the fact that he happened to be on the very first official TWA flight. And because his address was printed in the New York Times, I was able to find his house on Google Maps. Sid Jaffe, whoever you were, you made it into a YouTube video 96 years later, and unless this video totally bombs, about 200,000 people will now have heard of you. Now we come to Howard Hughes, one of the most enigmatic characters in America in the 20th century. He was born on Christmas Eve, some sources say Christmas Day, in 1905 in Houston, Texas. He was technically named Howard Robard Hughes Jr. Howard Robard Hughes Sr. was an oil tycoon whose fortune came from patenting a revolutionary new kind of drill bit for oil exploration. That was in 1909. Hughes Sr. probably didn't invent the bit, although there's no question that he got rich off of it, and he passed his fortune in the form of the Hughes Tool Company to his only child. Howard Jr. had very little interest in the oil business, or the drill bit business. By the age of 20, both of his parents were dead, and he was an emancipated miner with full control over a vast fortune. He was very interested in machines, particularly airplanes and movie cameras, which would be the bases of his twin obsessions during the rest of his life. He took his first flying lesson in 1919. The thing about Howard Hughes is that he never really had a profession. He wasn't a professional anything, neither a professional pilot, nor an entrepreneur, nor a film producer or director, though he was an enthusiastic amateur in all of those areas. Basically, he was a restless young man who had virtually unlimited money and the youth and idealism to spend that money doing the stuff he liked to do. This is in marked contrast to either Lindbergh or Jack Fry, who despite amateur backgrounds very much became professionals in the field of aviation, and especially aviation-related business. Hughes also suffered from a debilitating mental illness. Though not officially diagnosed in his lifetime, it's pretty much universally recognized as obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD. Reports of his symptoms before his breakdown in 1947 are all anecdotal, but he may have displayed some unusual behaviors as a child. There are reports of him lining up peas on his dinner plate in neat rows, and he may also have internalized the germophobia of his mother. I mention Hughes's mental state, not just as trivia or a salacious detail, but because it really did eventually have a major effect on the history of TWA. In 1927, the year of Lindbergh's famous flight and the same year Jack Fry helped found Standard Airlines, Howard Hughes began his first major foray into the film business. He had moved to Hollywood 2 years earlier and dabbled in some previous movies. But in 1927, he began working on Hell's Angels, the World War I flying epic that became the most expensive movie ever made up to that point. Hell's Angels, produced by Hughes, not directed by him, went into wide release in the US in November 1930, just as TWA's flight service was getting off the ground. Hughes chose and personally flew some of the aircraft used in the film. One of them almost killed him. He crashed a stunt plane, which he was flying, ironically because the regular pilot refused, judging the maneuver he asked for to be too dangerous. The hard recovery from the injuries in this crash may have been one of the early factors that exacerbated Hughes's developing mental illnesses. Hughes didn't officially get involved with TWA until the later 1930s, so it's a bit premature to bring him in on that story now. But because this chapter is a profile of what we might call the founders, I thought it appropriate to mention him. Let's move on to some more of TWA's milestone moments during the tumultuous decade between its founding and the outbreak of World War II. That story begins, chillingly enough, with another high-profile crash. This is Notre Dame Stadium in South Bend, Indiana. Originally built in 1930, it's been extensively remodeled since then, but it is the same stadium. Built also in that same year as TWA's first flight and the release of Hell's Angels. The Notre Dame football program, and this stadium in particular, are heavily associated with legendary football coach Knute Rockne, who led the team to 3 national championships and was hailed as a hero of the sport by the premature end of his lifetime. On March 31st, 1931, Rockne boarded a TWA flight from Kansas City, headed eventually to Los Angeles, aboard a Fokker F-10 trimotor. The coach was headed to Hollywood to consult on a film about the Notre Dame football team. Sometime that morning, the plane crashed into a desolate field near Wichita, Kansas. All 8 people aboard the plane, including Rockne, died. The legend of Rockne was later immortalized even further in the 1940 film Knute Rockne All-American, which featured a young Ronald Reagan. The future president did not play the role of Rockne, but of George Gipp, a famous Notre Dame player who died in 1920 and is said to have given Rockne an inspirational speech on his deathbed. If you ever wondered what the origin was of the "win one for the zipper" joke in the 1980 movie Airplane, that's it. Reagan appropriated the nickname the Gipper as a result of having played that role. Anyway, back to TWA. The U.S. Department of Commerce, through the Aeronautics Branch, opened what was then the most extensive plane crash investigation in U.S. history into the crash that killed Knute Rockne. They determined that a combination of weather conditions plus a design flaw in the Fokker F-10 caused the airplane's wing to delaminate and fall off. This accident occurred only 6 months after TWA's inaugural flights. See again the pattern, a triumphant step forward and a tragic step backward. Because of the Knute Rockne crash, The government ordered all Fokker airliners built before 1930 permanently grounded, which wiped out a significant part of TWA's fleet. The airline desperately needed new planes, both bigger and safer. In 1932, after an internal study conducted by Lindbergh, Jack Fry, and Daniel Tomlinson, Vice President of Research, TWA requested from 5 major aircraft manufacturers a new airliner that would meet their needs. The answer from Douglas Aircraft Corporation was the DC-1. It was an answer both to TWA's request and also to Boeing's new airliner, the 247, which United Airlines was using. The DC-1 was more advanced than the 247. Incredibly, only one DC-1 was ever produced. It was the prototype model, which TWA accepted in September 1933. But Douglas was already working on the more advanced version, which became the DC-2. In late 1933, just as the DC-1 arrived, the federal government, now under the Democratic administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt, was investigating the provision of airmail contracts awarded under Walter Folger Brown, the Postmaster General of the now disgraced Hoover administration. After a Senate investigation, the new Postmaster General, Homer Cummings, canceled all the nation's airmail contracts. Because airlines were subsidized by these contracts, this was a serious financial blow to all the majors, including TWA. For a brief time in February and March 1934, the U.S. Army took it upon itself to deliver mail by air. It was a disaster. The Army didn't have the right planes and their capacity was limited. No fewer than 66 Army planes crashed while trying to deliver the mail, killing 12 pilots. The FDR administration quickly backpedaled. In April 1934, a new regime of federal airmail contracts was reorganized. Airlines that had previous contracts dating from the 1930s deals with Walter Brown could bid for new ones, but only if they had fresh personnel at the top who were not involved in the tainted contracts. That was how Jack Fry became president of TWA in the spring of 1934. He would remain at the head of the airline for the next 13 years. The reorganized airmail contract structure resulted in the beginnings of federal regulation of aviation as it later came to be. TWA and the other majors were less economically dependent on the mail contracts and thus more focused on passenger operations. Little by little, the pieces of the modern commercial aviation system were falling into place. The same year, 1934, the arrival of the DC-2 marked a major step forward for TWA and indeed the other airlines too. Because this plane was larger and required a different set of crew skills than the airline had been using before, TWA introduced stewardesses, called hostesses, by order of Jack Fry in 1935. Previously, all flight service had been done by co-pilots. There were strict height, weight, and age requirements for women recruited as hostesses. Among other things, they had to be registered nurses. The sexism inherent in the profession of stewardesses in the golden age of air travel was present from the very beginning. Attractive, single white women were the only image the airline wanted to show to the public. A TWA executive told the first class of hostess trainees in late 1935, quote, "If you haven't found a man to keep you by the time you're 28, TWA won't want you either," end quote. Although the DC-2 had been a success, aircraft design was already moving beyond it. On December 17, 1935, McDonnell test flew its newest design, the DC-3. To say that this plane was revolutionary is an understatement. In my personal opinion, the DC-3 is the coolest plane ever built. Designed as the Douglas sleeping transport, the idea behind the DC-3 was to provide a plane big enough for comfortable sleeping berths, so airlines could compete on coast-to-coast service, which in late 1935, TWA basically owned. The impetus for the DC-3 came from the CEO of American Airlines, hoping to beat TWA at the Transcontinental Air Service game. Indeed, Jack Fry had to haggle with the TWA corporate board to purchase DC-3s as they started rolling off the assembly line in early 1936. The airline board members thought they'd already laid out quite enough money recently for the DC-1 and 2, thank you, but Fry understood how critical the DC-3 would turn out to be for the airlines. TWA ordered 10 in 1936. The DC-3 was comfortable, attractive, designed intuitively, easy to fly, and cheap to fix. By the time the United States entered World War II, 80% of the airliners flying regularly in the country were DC-3s. In fact, the plane was so well made and so durable that incredibly, there are still some of these planes flying today in 2026, 90 years after its introduction. In our own era of planned obsolescence and technological innovation for its own sake, examples of machines that are that reliable and long-lasting are pretty hard to find. This is why the DC-3 stands alone. The introduction of this plane should have made TWA a crowning financial success. But again, we see the pattern of every advance in the airline's history being followed by a retreat, a misstep, or a disaster. The airline was losing $1 million a year by 1937, mainly because of its purchases of airliners. The value of the stock was plummeting. And then, the next year especially, one of TWA's chief intangible assets, Charles Lindbergh, rapidly became a liability. Lindbergh had already pulled back from his involvement with TWA. He and his wife, Anne Morrow Lindbergh, were devastated when their baby was kidnapped and brutally killed in 1932 in one of the most high-profile criminal cases of the 20th century, which played out endlessly in the headlines. They moved to England to escape publicity and to try to regroup. While in Europe, Lindbergh, still a valuable publicity tool, was courted by none other than Hermann Goering, head of the Nazi Air Force, the Luftwaffe. Goering wined and dined Lindbergh in 1936 and invited him to the opening of the Berlin Olympics. Whether this was truly the beginning of or just a major milestone in Lindbergh's admiration for the Nazi regime isn't entirely clear. But in October 1938, he did receive a medal and a certificate of appreciation from none other than Adolf Hitler, commemorating his famous flight 11 years earlier. And Lindbergh and his wife were, for a time, planning to move to Berlin. Just a month later, in November 1938, the Nazi regime instigated a savage round of riots, persecutions, and insurance swindles against Germany's remaining Jewish population, the famous Kristallnacht, which many historians mark as the beginning of the Holocaust. This event, heavily reported in the worldwide press, turned many Americans against the Nazis, even some who had previously been admiring toward them, however enthusiastic or begrudging they might have been. Charles Lindbergh, however, didn't get the memo. Though he was strangely puzzled by the barbarity of Kristallnacht, he refused to return the medal and certificate from Hitler, and even doubled down on his isolationist politics, appearing frequently in support of the America First Committee, urging the U.S. not to get embroiled in another potential war against Germany that was clearly brewing. TWA had, since 1930, proudly proclaimed itself as the Lindbergh Line. After Kristallnacht, however, they suddenly changed their advertising to the Transcontinental Line, or more commonly, the airline run by flyers. A bit less catchy, but having the name of a Nazi sympathizer as your ad slogan was just bad business in 1939. Charles Lindbergh never again had any significant relationship with TWA. Lindbergh aside, problems in TWA's boardroom continued to plague the airline. Jack Fry frequently clashed with the board of directors, dominated by a relatively new investor, John Hertz. Yes, the rent-a-car company is named after and associated with him. Fry sought a new investor who he hoped would buy up a bunch of TWA's stock and come down on the side of the pilots and aviation men rather than the corporate suits. Well, he found someone all right, Howard Hughes, who had known Fry and Paul Richter for years, and who was, as we've seen, an aviation enthusiast. When Howard Hughes got interested in something, he wanted to go all in on it right away. This was certainly true with TWA. In early 1939, he secretly began buying up huge amounts of TWA's publicly traded stock, so much that by May, he was the largest single shareholder. Then he put the screws to Hertz, threatening to take over the company. Hertz and his co-investors, which included the Lehman Brothers, yes, those Lehman Brothers, sold their interests to Hughes. By mid-1939, TWA was now firmly under the control of Howard Hughes. This, as we'll see, was to have huge consequences down the line. But about that time, international events again intervened and shaped TWA's fortunes. You probably know what those events are. Let's talk about them in the next chapter. Adolf Hitler, who I sometimes refer to as the Mustache, kicked off World War II in Europe with his invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939. The outbreak of the war in Europe naturally changed a lot of things, but it didn't impact TWA's story as much as it did Pan Am's. Pan Am, as you recall, was an overseas carrier, and TWA a domestic one. Air travel surged during the period between the outbreak of World War II in Europe and the United States joining the conflict. In 1940, for example, TWA carried over 250,000 passengers, a 57% increase in traffic over the previous year. But it was still losing money. Jack Fry was ordering new planes. Although the DC-3 was already the workhorse of all the domestic airlines, he was thinking toward the future. He had ordered a number of Boeing's new planes, the 307, also known as the Stratoliner, the first four-engined pressurized airliner. When Hughes came aboard TWA in 1939, he took one of the 6 307s for himself and allowed TWA to have the other 5, another pattern that would be repeated later. TWA flew its first flight with a 307 Stratoliner in July 1940. Hughes loved designing and building new aircraft almost more than anything else, and as soon as he came on as TWA's largest owner, he and Jack Fry sought to make a deal with an aircraft manufacturer for yet another cutting-edge airliner. This time the builder was Lockheed. In the summer of 1939, Hughes, Fry, and the Lockheed brass had a marathon 8-hour phone conference at long-distance rates to work out what they wanted and what Lockheed could deliver. What eventually came out of the deal was the Constellation, a plane that would be particularly associated with TWA in later years. In Martin Scorsese's 2004 film The Aviator, about this period in Hughes' life, there's a colorful scene depicting Hughes making a rash purchase of 40 Constellations. Brent Spiner, famous for playing Mr. Data on Star Trek The Next Generation, plays Robert Gross, the president of Lockheed. The scene is fun and illustrates some of Hughes' quirks, but it is not accurate to history, though it is true that TWA eventually ordered 40 Constellations. You know what happened on December 7th, 1941. The Pearl Harbor attack makes frequent appearances in many of my videos. When the United States entered the war, first against Japan and then shortly against the other Axis powers, the War Department and the Army requisitioned many of TWA's planes, including all of its Boeing 307s, which it redesignated C-75s to use as troop transports. TWA threw itself into the war effort, establishing something called the Intercontinental Division, which contracted with the War Department to fly troops and cargo on formerly TWA-owned planes to war zones. There was still plenty of domestic business. People needed airlines during the war even more than they had before it, because travel on the highways was curtailed by gasoline and rubber rationing, and so many trains were tied up in military operations. But of course, the government and military had dibs on airline seats, so civilian passengers were lucky to get tickets that weren't requisitioned. TWA's planes traveled full up so routinely that the airline stopped advertising during the war. But of course, there was tragedy. One of the airline's most high-profile crashes occurred a bit more than a month after the U.S. entered the conflict. On January 16, 1942, Hollywood actress Carole Lombard got aboard TWA Flight 3 at Indianapolis. The flight was making its various hops from New York to the L.A. area. Lombard was on a tour to sell war bonds. Aboard the plane was her mother and a press agent that worked for her husband, actor Clark Gable. Not long after takeoff, the DC-3 crashed into Potosi Mountain, southwest of Las Vegas. All 22 people aboard the plane were killed, including Carole Lombard. An investigation found that the cause of the crash was probably the pilot following the wrong navigation course. And because so many light beacons on the route were blacked out due to wartime conditions, they never knew they were off course. Gable was so devastated by the death of his wife that he quit Hollywood, at least for a time, and joined the Army, where he served with the U.S. Army Air Corps and flew at least 5 combat missions. Pieces of the wreckage of TWA Flight 3 remain on Potosi Mountain to this day. You're looking at one, part of one of the Wright Cyclone engines that powered the DC-3. All air crashes are awful, but people who worked on this one and viewed the wreckage said it was especially horrendous. During the war, Howard Hughes was continually distracted by various vanity projects. What you have to understand is that he controlled TWA, owning the vast majority of the stock, but he didn't run it. He wasn't even on the board of directors. He delegated his fix-it man, Noah Dietrich, the character played by John C. Reilly in the film The Aviator, to deal with the board. But TWA was coupled to the Hughes fortune. Most of his money was parked in his father's oil drill company called Hughes Tool Company, which gave massive loans to TWA throughout the time of Hughes's control. Hughes also refused to do anything that would dilute his ownership of TWA in even the slightest degree. It was his toy, and he wasn't going to share it with anyone else. It really was a sort of flashy, expensive plaything for him, similar in many respects to how TWA would become the toy of Carl Icahn some 40 years later. Neither Hughes nor Icahn treated it like a real business, or even thought of themselves as being in the airline business. In any event, though Hughes liked to do things like make deals for the Constellation, he spent most of his time on minutiae involving films he was producing, particularly the sexy western The Outlaw with Jane Russell, and planes he was building. Those included a reconnaissance plane called the XF-11, and of course the creation Hughes is most famous for, the Hercules, a colossal transport more popularly known as the Spruce Goose. Neither of these planes are especially relevant to the story of TWA, except to the extent that they diverted Hughes's attention and resources away from what he might otherwise have been doing, which was making strategic decisions to improve the fortunes of the airline he owned. The stories of both the XF-11 and the Spruce Goose ended badly. Hughes himself was at the controls during the test flight of the XF-11 in July 1946, and he crashed it into a residential area of Beverly Hills, nearly killing himself in the process. The Hercules flew only once in November 1947, and only for a fairly short distance. It has spent the rest of its existence in warehouses and gigantic museum hangars, such as the one near McMinnville, Oregon, where it is now. It's impressive, but it was never very useful, and was grotesquely expensive. The war was generally good for TWA and for the other airlines. Not only did aviation technology and the industrial capacity to build vast numbers of airplanes increase exponentially during the war, but it also worked a changeover in the kind of customers that airlines would eventually serve after it. Before 1941, air travel was a thing for elites, rich people, Hollywood stars like Carole Lombard, and wealthy business travelers who could afford the extra cost to get there fast. The war introduced a lot of ordinary people to air travel for the first time, both in civilian and military capacities, and it laid the groundwork for a post-war consumer society that had the disposable income to spend on air travel. Furthermore, TWA came of age in the 1930s, the era of the Great Depression. People like Jack Fry and Howard Hughes could now imagine what it could do in a boom time of prosperity. For a while, those dreams did become a reality, but as always in the TWA story, there was a dark side to it too. Let's tackle all of that in the next chapter. In June 1944, as World War II was reaching its terrible climax in Europe and the Pacific, TWA submitted a document to the Civil Aeronautics Board, which was now the U.S. government agency that oversaw airlines. The CAB had to approve all new airline routes and fares and set strict rules on how airlines operated. TWA's bid was for overseas routes, by which they would create an around-the-world air network, expanding the original vision of a transcontinental airline to, if you'll forgive the expression, a Trans World Airline, to which TWA would officially change its name in 1950. Previously, the only US-based airline that flew overseas was Pan American Airways, and Juan Trippe, the head of Pan Am, had worked pretty hard to try to keep it that way. He failed. In addition to TWA's bid, American Airlines proposed to offer overseas routes through a new subsidiary. The CAB approved TWA's plans in early July 1945, a month before the war came to an end. The airline would now serve Paris, Rome, the Iberian Peninsula, North Africa, the Middle East, and even India. This was part of a strategic expansion of US airlines for the post-war era. The first regularly scheduled TWA flight from New York to Paris took off in a Constellation on February 5, 1946. The airline also used Constellations to shrink the time needed for cross-country trips, as Howard Hughes himself demonstrated with great press fanfare by piloting a Constellation from LA to New York in 8.5 hours, with his movie star friends Veronica Lake, Cary Grant, and William Powell on board. TWA hadn't gotten to use its Constellations much during the war because they were being used by the US government. So the true phase-in of the new plane didn't come until 1945 and early 1946. This delayed timing proved problematic because McDonnell was developing its new plane, the DC-6, which was introduced precisely to compete with the Lockheed Constellation. But because TWA had already spent so much money on new planes in the past 10 years, they were basically stuck with the Constellation, regardless of what shiny new model came out of the engineers' drafting rooms next. Bringing in the Constellations was also expensive, and incredibly, TWA was running out of money when it should have been flush with cash. It was a result of the usual financial neglect by Howard Hughes. To make matters worse, the Airline Pilots Association went on strike against TWA in October 1946. The strike was settled, but the cost of pay raises for the pilots were pretty steep, and by the end of that year, TWA had lost $14 million. In order to rescue the airline financially, TWA had to appeal to its sugar daddy, Howard Hughes. As you remember, Hughes' tool company, the real source of his money, was always the life support system for TWA. In early 1947, Hughes proposed that the tool company, which he called Tool Co., lend $10 million to TWA, with the loan to be paid back by conversion into common stock. And Tool Co. would have a majority of seats on the TWA board. Jack Fry, who, as you recall, had brought Hughes into TWA in the first place, hated this idea. A dramatic boardroom battle ensued in January 1947. Fry eventually lost, in part because the financing he hoped to line up from a large New York insurance company refused to give the airline more cash. Jack Fry and Paul Richter, who had been with TWA since the beginning, quit. Noah Dietrich, Howard Hughes' hatchet man, got a seat on the TWA board. He knew nothing about the airline business. Hughes had leveraged the financial crisis to gain direct control of the company. It was kind of useless, though, because, as he often was, Hughes was quickly distracted again. He was soon busy fighting a PR battle against Pan Am and a particular senator, Ralph Owen Brewster of Maine, who was investigating Hughes and his companies for war profiteering, wasting government money on, among other things, the Spruce Goose. Brewster also had ties to Juan Trippe and Pan Am. I talked about that in my Pan Am video. This story is the main climax of Scorsese's Aviator film. Hughes' showdown with Brewster in a series of dramatic Senate hearings in the summer of 1947 is an interesting story, but not the main one to tell here. After those hearings and the test flight of the Spruce Goose, the Hercules, in November 1947, Howard Hughes seems to have had a nervous breakdown. This was the period where he started living in darkened penthouses and movie projection rooms, obsessing about germs. He never again appeared in public. The Aviator film gets the sequence of events wrong, but it is true that Hughes' OCD kicked into high gear during this period. At least the movie doesn't show him going around with Kleenex boxes on his feet, a well-known bit of Howard Hughes lore, despite the fact that it can't be substantiated. Because of Hughes' reclusiveness and mental problems, and also his obsessive mania for control, crucial decisions often went unmade at TWA or were made too late. It was common for Howard Hughes to summon high-level people to a business meeting, sometimes from across the country, and then fail to show up for the meeting. Yet he insisted on controlling decisions, especially on what airplanes to buy. In 1948, TWA's new president, Lamont Kohu, who had replaced Jack Fry, quit because Hughes ghosted everyone during negotiations to buy new planes from Convair. Eventually, Cohu was replaced by Ralph Damon, who'd formerly been with American Airlines. Unlike past execs, Damon could actually deal with Howard Hughes and navigate his eccentricities. Under him, TWA finally struggled back into profitability, making $3.7 million in 1949. The early 50s were a boom time for the airline, with expanded routes, improved service, and a marketing campaign aimed toward new middle-class leisure travelers, including women, which other airlines generally weren't marketing to. The emphasis was on air travel as a part of a family vacation. In 1954, TWA even entered into a special marketing arrangement with Walt Disney, who was about to open Disneyland in Anaheim. TWA got to feature Disneyland in its advertisements and had a special Rocket to the Moon ride showing a space rocket with TWA livery established in the park, which opened with great success in 1955. If TWA was diligently and competently run, the 50s should have been the time the airline built the foundation for its domination of the air travel industry for decades to come. That didn't happen. Jet airliners were clearly coming. The Boeing 707 was in development. And Howard Hughes, if he had been the cutting-edge aviation pioneer that he thought he was and tried to be, should have known that. The truth was, he was still stuck on the Constellation. Though he did make some occasional deals on other types of planes, TWA remained committed to the Connie. Lockheed was desperate to keep its contracts with TWA going. To compete with newer generation airliners, it kept making improvements to engines to increase the Constellation's range, which Hughes usually settled for. The problem was, though, that the Constellation, whatever new versions Lockheed came up with, was destined for obsolescence as soon as the 707 came on the scene. In January 1956, Ralph Damon, president of TWA, died suddenly. His replacement couldn't really stand up to Howard Hughes, but at least the tycoon had finally recognized the opportunity and the threat of the 707. In March, 2 months after Damon's death, Hughes started buying 707s, but he was late to the game. Boeing already had a backlog of orders, and TWA was in line behind American and United Airlines. Furthermore, Hughes didn't buy the 707s for TWA. He bought them through Hughes Tool Company and insisted that Tool Co. was only lending them to TWA. He wouldn't even let the company own its own planes. At roughly the same time, Hughes also bought 30 Convair 880 jets. Together with the 707s, Howard Hughes' new toy box of airplanes cost $400 million, a financial burden even Tool Co. couldn't sustain. TWA began flying the 707 domestically in March 1959. The transition from piston-driven airliners to jets was smooth and successful, and the airlines were raking in money in this period. But because of its bizarre financial arrangements and the price of that $400 million toy box, TWA was in a precarious position. Noah Dietrich, Hughes' fixer, finally had enough of the eccentric tycoon and quit in early 1957, having served him for 32 years. This left Hughes' financial empire in an even more rickety condition. Hughes' own exit from TWA was triggered by another impulse purchase, that of movie company RKO Studios, which he had to borrow $12 million to finance. When that loan came due in October 1960, the lender threatened to force both Tool Co. and TWA to declare bankruptcy unless they got paid back. At the same time, Convair demanded payment for those 30 planes that Hughes had previously ordered. Howard Hughes was out of money. In order to save Tool Co. and TWA, he was forced to agree to a plan engineered by a deep-pocket lender, Dillon Read and Company. The lender would pump $260 million into TWA so they could buy all of Howard's planes that he'd been hoarding. But Hughes' stooges on the TWA board of directors had to quit, and he had to put all of his TWA stock, which totaled 78% of the company, into a special voting trust that did not answer to him. He had no choice. On December 30th, 1960, the plan went into effect. TWA was now free of Howard Hughes, or so they thought. It wasn't quite over. In fact, it was just the beginning of a new phase of battle with Howard Hughes, which I'll talk about later. But as the 1960s dawned, it certainly seemed like a new era for the airline. And indeed, in many ways, it turned out to be its heyday. The decade of the 1960s was truly the golden age of air travel. Not for nothing do most of our pop culture images of the supposed glamour of air transportation date from this period. The image of James Bond as a globe-trotting jet-setter, beautiful stewardesses, dashing pilots in well-tailored uniforms, and the long, sleek, modern-looking planes that could take you from New York to LA, or from New York to London, or Paris, or Rome in half a day. Pan Am was of course the apotheosis of this aesthetic, but TWA was part of it too, and deservedly so. Flying TWA was good in these years. The service was fast, smooth, and generally safe, with some high-profile exceptions, such as a ghastly crash over Staten Island, New York in December 1960. TWA's food was thought of as exceptional among airlines, and in first class on the 707s, it was served on tablecloths, with real silverware and china, not the plastic forks in a bag like we see on today's planes. And of course, there was the Flight Center, TWA's brand new futuristic terminal in New York's Idlewild Airport, eventually called JFK Airport. What you're looking at now are views of the modern TWA hotel, which is built in the old Flight Center building that has fortunately been preserved. The building was a living advertisement for TWA, designed by Finnish-born architect Eero Saarinen, most famous for designing the Gateway Arch in St. Louis. The shape of the Flight Center was said to have been based on, of all things, a grapefruit peel, but it was definitely futuristic. And as you can see, absolutely of its time. I mean, doesn't it look like it was designed in 1957? Construction began in June 1959, and cost overruns inflated the price tag to $15 million, the equivalent of almost $120 million today. With jetways, tunnels, lounges, reader boards, and ticket counters, the Flight Center was supposed to put the traveler in the center of this dreamy, modernistic universe of sleekness, style, and bright red comfort. Ironically, though, the Flight Center was a victim of TWA's success. It had been designed in the 50s, before the 707 came online, which vastly increased the sheer number of passengers flowing through the TWA system. As a result, the Flight Center was overcrowded and cumbersome for passengers, and its physical limitations made it harder, not easier, to serve them and get them to their flights. But the Flight Center was successful, at least as an advertisement for TWA. Not to be outdone, Pan Am had its own version of the Flight Center, which I talked about in my Pan Am video, but that building doesn't exist anymore. The Flight Center, fortunately, survived. Though TWA is a thing of the past, the creation of the hotel as a throwback to the heyday of the golden age of air travel is, I think, a marvelous thing, a piece of living history that can connect people to this vanished era of the past. There's even a Constellation plane in the hotel, memorializing the aircraft that TWA and Howard Hughes staked much of the airline's fortunes on, for better or for worse. TWA had a new president for this new era, Charles Tillinghast, who took over in 1961. Much of his job was to dig out from the hole that Howard Hughes had left the airline in. He ordered a bunch of new 707s right off the bat. Hughes wasn't out of the picture, though. He really resented having his toy taken away from him, and he plotted for the rest of his life to try to regain control of TWA by getting his 78% of shares out of that voting trust. In 1961, he came up with a Rube Goldberg-like legal scheme to try to force the airline to buy Corvair 990s, a plane he liked better than the 707. Tillinghast called his bluff and sued Hughes for $35 million in damages. He also used a legal maneuver that scared the hell out of Howard Hughes, a request that Hughes appear personally at a deposition. If you wanted to manipulate Howard Hughes, that was the way to do it. Because appearing anywhere in public, or even leaving his penthouse or projection room, was a prospect so terrifying that he would do anything to try to avoid it. The litigation between TWA and Hughes stretched on in several different courts for years, even past the end of Hughes's own lifetime. But overall, times were good for TWA in the 1960s. It posted a profit of $19.8 million in 1963, $37 million in 1964, and $50 million in 1965. The stock price soared. TWA became known as the airline of choice for celebrities or movie stars. Frank Sinatra and Danny Kaye flew frequently, as did Cary Grant, Steve Allen, Jane Meadows, and Grace Kelly, even after she became the Princess of Monaco. In the later 1960s, as the old Constellations were finally phased out, TWA needed new planes for shorter-haul domestic routes. Enter the Boeing 727, one of the true workhorse planes of the jet age. TWA also bought a number of DC-9s, which was Douglas's answer to the 727. When the last Constellation retired in 1967, TWA became the first domestic airline with a fleet entirely made up of jets. In a corporate sense, the airline was never stronger than it was at this time. In 1966, incredibly, TWA bought Hilton, the famed hotel company, forming a conglomerate that executives hoped would synthesize air travel and hotel destinations in a seamless continuum. Bizarrely, TWA later bought a company called Canteen Corporation, which was in the vending machine business, a strange arena for an airline to want to enter, but whatever. In the second half of the 1960s, TWA went to war again. After the Lyndon B. Johnson administration deepened America's involvement in the Vietnam War with the direct commitment of U.S. combat forces, the Pentagon contracted with TWA to fly troops to Southeast Asia, mostly through Honolulu and Okinawa. By 1967, TWA was running 25 flights a month in this program. Pan Am also transported U.S. forces to Vietnam. It was a major part of the war effort. At the end of the decade in 1969, having returned the airline to profitability, Charles Tillinghast stepped down as TWA president, though he retained the role of CEO. His replacement was a man called Forwood C. Weiser Jr., whose nickname was Bud. Yes, you heard that right. He was Bud Weiser. Come on, I couldn't resist that joke. If the 60s were good for TWA, the 70s were, well, not. Unfortunately, the halcyon days couldn't last forever. And if you've been paying attention to the pattern, great steps forward followed by equally large steps backward, you can guess what was coming for Trans World Airlines. On August 29, 1969, two Palestinian militants, Layla Khalid and Salim Asawi, waving guns and hand grenades around, commandeered a TWA 707 en route from Rome to Tel Aviv, Israel. Khalid and Asawi were members of a Marxist-leaning terrorist group called the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. In their statement, the PFLP operatives singled out the United States, and particularly TWA, as their target, because TWA served as one of the major links between the US and Israel. The terrorists took the plane to Damascus, Syria, where they released all the passengers except for 6 and torched the cockpit. TWA's president, Bud Weiser, I still can't believe that was his name, got involved in the official negotiations for the release of the remaining hostages. Miraculously, no one was killed in the incident. Only a few months later, on Halloween 1969, a former U.S. Marine and Vietnam War veteran hijacked TWA Flight 85 from LA to San Francisco. Incredibly, he eventually took the plane to Rome, where he got away for a time, but was eventually captured by Italian police. No one was hurt. In September 1970, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine struck again, and once again chose TWA as a target, although they also nicked 4 other airliners from various airlines in the largest simultaneous hijack operation ever, eclipsing even 9/11. Layla Khalid, mastermind of the 1969 plot, was involved in this one too, although the hijacking of the flight she was on was ultimately thwarted. 3 of the 5 planes eventually wound up at a remote desert airstrip in Jordan called Dawson's Field. The drama played out for a week and eventually involved U.S. President Richard Nixon, British Prime Minister Edward Heath, and Hussein, the King of Jordan. Although only one person, a terrorist, died in the incident itself, it was the impetus for Hussein to retaliate against Palestinians inside Jordan, which ultimately killed 20,000 people. The 3 planes at Dawson's Field were blown up after the passengers and crew were released. These incidents, as well as others, marked TWA unofficially as the airline of choice of international terrorists. In part, this was because of proximity. TWA was the American carrier that flew the most routes across the Mediterranean and to the Middle East. TWA's operations were significantly impacted by wars between Israel and its Arab neighbors, which broke out in 1967 and again in 1973. TWA was thus even more deeply involved in international relations and terrorism than Pan Am was. The violence coincided with both good times and bad times for the airline. On the positive side, a massive new plane, the Boeing 747, was again revolutionizing jet airline travel. It was huge and glamorous, but extremely expensive. Each one cost $22 million, and they needed bigger terminals and runways to operate. The 747s became as important to TWA's service as they were to Pan Am's in the same period. On the negative side of the ledger, air travel in general was going through an upheaval in the early 1970s. TWA lost $72.5 million in 1970, but bounced back in 1971 to a $3.2 million profit, though this was largely due to the success of Hilton hotels. And even in 1972, when TWA made over $33 million in profit, its rate of return on investment was much lower than other airlines and what the government had hoped. In other words, TWA was pretty fragile. The 747 was a hit, but another plane TWA unwisely invested in, the Lockheed L-1011, was largely a flop. The engines on this plane didn't work too well, and this nearly forced Lockheed into bankruptcy. They needed a bailout from the federal government to stay afloat. TWA should have gone with the DC-10, McDonnell's answer to the L-1011. It was another bad call that cost the airline millions. Speaking of bad calls, TWA also got into trouble with its flight attendants. The sexist attitudes that TWA had always had toward its women employees persisted, even after TWA built a dedicated flight attendant training academy at Overland Park, Kansas, the largest such facility in the entire airline industry. TWA had started hiring male flight attendants at this time, but for the women they had a hard and fast rule. If they got pregnant, they would be fired. TWA wanted only single women who weren't mothers. The flight attendants ultimately challenged this rule in court and with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. TWA lost, but rehiring flight attendants who had previously been fired under the rule triggered more litigation based on unfairness in seniority rules. That case dragged on until 1982 and went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. This was while TWA was still in litigation with Howard Hughes and eventually his estate over all the mishegas that he'd put the airline through back in the 50s and 60s. The oil crisis of 1973, triggered by Arab countries' retaliation for U.S. support of Israel in the Yom Kippur War, was utterly brutal for all the airlines because of vastly increased fuel costs, which pinched at the same time as passenger volume went down. TWA fared even worse because many of its routes in the Mediterranean and Middle East were affected by political turmoil. Add to this 2 bad crashes in late 1974, and the airline posted a loss of $121 million by the mid-70s. Poor Bud Weiser literally had a nervous breakdown and was replaced by Charles E. Meyer. Things began to look up in the latter half of the 70s as air travel rebounded and there was a slight lull for a couple of years between major recessions. In this period, TWA and its corporate partners, Hilton and Canteen Corporation, remember the vending machine company, were reorganized, all three becoming sibling subsidiaries of Trans World Corporation. This might have been the start of a renaissance for the airline, but unfortunately, the company's and the industry's most powerful enemy was starting to appear on the horizon: deregulation. By the mid-1970s, the system of managing America's air travel system, which had developed in the 1930s, was becoming admittedly old and creaky. Politicians, many but by no means all of them conservatives, were increasingly championing privatization of key industries and elements of infrastructure. Both the United States and the UK would embark on large-scale privatization projects under the concurrent reigns of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. But the idea of airline deregulation was an early warning sign of this trend. In the U.S., Senator Edward Kennedy, decidedly not a conservative, was the legislative champion of deregulation. The problem was, though, that the plan was basically to wave a magic wand and make the CAB and airline regulation disappear overnight without any real transition plan or opportunity for the airline industry to prepare. The CAB, despite its cumbersome nature, had for the most part kept fares down and guaranteed service to many parts of the U.S., including smaller cities with less competitive airline markets. TWA was not in favor of deregulation. In its 1975 annual report to shareholders, the company said, quote, "While we feel strongly that there should be much less stringent control over fares and rates, we believe that deregulation would be detrimental to the continuation of a private enterprise air transportation system of the type we now enjoy. The inevitable result would be a reduction in service to smaller communities and the elimination of a number of carriers. Chaos rather than an improved regulatory system would result from the administration's proposals." End quote. This is one of the most prophetic statements I'm aware of ever to appear in a corporate document. Deregulation would indeed have all of those effects. So if you allow me to digress for a moment, it's worth taking just a minute to examine how and why deregulation was bad for the industry. Previously, the CAB approved all routes individually. Airlines going a certain direction had to service certain places, even if they didn't do huge volume to those specific places. For example, say for whatever reason you wanted to go from New York City to Tulsa, Oklahoma. According to this TWA timetable from 1968, you could do that easily. Flight 55 on a Boeing 727 would take off at 2 p.m. and have you there at 5:35. There's some time zone changes there after a stop in St. Louis. Flight 55 was a transcontinental flight, ultimately terminating in San Francisco, and it had TWA's highest level of service. After deregulation, airlines eliminated flights to smaller volume places like Tulsa, even if they were realistically on the way to somewhere else. That's because all the big airlines adopted a hub and spoke model. Now there's a hub and a base of operations at a certain city, and all of their routes radiate outward from the hubs. Today, depending on the airline you fly, you've got to fly to Chicago or Houston or Atlanta or Salt Lake City or Denver, and then catch a smaller commuter airline, usually owned by or with a code-sharing arrangement with a bigger airline, to get to Tulsa. Of over 500 flights I found, only 3, yes 3, did not route through a hub. These flights were run by Tiny Republic Airways, a puddle jumper that contracts out to American and Delta Airlines. Trust me, you're not going to get the white glove service of TWA, the kind they deployed on transcontinental routes in 1968 on Republic Airways. And you would pay, adjusted for inflation, almost as much today for that bare-bones, no-frills flight as you would have in 1968 for full-scale TWA service. Think you'd get a square meal from Republic Airways on your way to Tulsa? If by square meal you mean a tiny foil bag of peanuts, well, maybe. Air travel has regressed mightily in the past 50 years. Thanks, Edward Kennedy. Another problem with the hub and spoke model is that it makes the entire air travel system extremely fragile. Suppose an airline hub is in Denver, and Denver gets hit by a snowstorm. Because it's not just flights to Denver that are affected, but everywhere the airline that hubs in that city flies, almost all travelers going anywhere on that airline are going to be stranded with their flights canceled, even in airports that don't see a single snowflake. Every year, there's at least one massive air travel calamity that's caused by something like this, where millions of people are stranded and wind up sleeping on the floor in airports. Perhaps it's happened to you. In 1968, a snowstorm in Denver would likely result in TWA canceling 4 flights out of dozens the airline ran daily, not counting the international ones. And in 1968, TWA owned a hotel chain where if you were stranded overnight, they could and would put you up easily, no hassle. Again, the air travel system has regressed, just as TWA and many observers predicted that it would. Enough about the practical effects of deregulation. Good idea or not, it was policy, shepherded through Congress by the aforementioned Senator Kennedy and signed into law by President Jimmy Carter in October 1978. Almost immediately, the economic and operational landscape of airlines changed. TWA posted profits of $35 million in 1978, but that was the last time for several years that it would profit at all. Shortly after deregulation in 1979, TWA caught the attention of the first of a series of corporate raiders who would later shape its legacy. Frank Lorenzo had worked at TWA in the 1960s and also at Eastern Airlines. In the 70s, he took over Texas International Airlines, which was in severe financial distress. He managed to improve Texas Air's financial condition, but at a high cost, and not just a cost in money. Lorenzo's sine qua non was a hatred of labor unions. He hated labor unions, and cost-cutting programs at airlines he was involved in usually began with trying to break the power of the major unions as a means to cut wages and operating costs. Most of TWA's workforce was unionized, mainly pilots, flight attendants, and maintenance people. When Lorenzo began buying up large amounts of TWA's stock, people within the company realized they were possibly a takeover target. It didn't work. TWA's board, terrified of Lorenzo, was unanimously against it, and he didn't have the resources for a hostile takeover. Just for clarification, a hostile takeover is when someone goes directly to the shareholders and buys up a controlling portion of their stock, not necessarily a majority, against the wishes and recommendations of the company's board of directors. It's kind of hard to pull off in practice because it involves turning the company's management against a significant number of their shareholders. In 1980, Lorenzo couldn't do it, and he dumped his TWA stock. But he wasn't finished. The problem was that TWA cost a lot to run. It always had. In the era of deregulation, lots of new small airlines suddenly popped up in the weeds. Small lines could attract business by operating small fleets of planes at a low cost, and thus low fares that attracted passengers. The big airlines faced a Hobson's choice, essentially. They could compete with those low fares, which meant losing money, or they could just pull out of the small markets and abandon those routes to the newcomers. That's basically what TWA did in the early 1980s. Remember the hub and spoke problem I described a minute ago? In 1982, TWA officially made St. Louis its hub for domestic routes, and New York's JFK the hub for its international ones. But in a major way, St. Louis was a bad choice because there was already an airline there that did a lot of business, Ozark Airlines, which was founded in 1950 but got a new lease on life in the era of deregulation. So now TWA was a fierce competitor with Ozark on what should have been its home turf at a time when the entire industry was in chaos. This was the beginning of truly bad times for TWA. Unfortunately, it got worse, especially in the summer of 1985. That's the subject of the next chapter. On June 14, 1985, TWA Flight 847, a 727 flying from Athens to Rome, was hijacked right after takeoff by two Lebanese men with connections to the terrorist group Hezbollah. They demanded that the pilot, John Testrake, fly the plane to Beirut, the capital of Lebanon, which was then in the midst of one of the most devastating civil wars of the 20th century. Beirut was a magnet for terrorist activity, with various militants, militias, and factions, some supported by the government of Iran, basing operations there. The hijacking of TWA Flight 847 began an odyssey that lasted 16 days, an excruciating ordeal for the flight's passengers and crew. The hijackers shuttled the plane between Beirut and Algiers. Their chief demand was the release of 700 prisoners being held in Israeli custody. At one point in Algiers, the terrorists demanded the plane be refueled for another hop back to Beirut. The ground crew refused unless the fuel was paid for. Yuli Derrickson, a flight attendant, an American citizen born in Germany, paid for the fuel with her credit card, nearly $6,000 worth, temporarily defusing the standoff. Derrickson also intervened to save the lives of passengers. The terrorists wanted her to single out the passports of the passengers who had Jewish-sounding names. Mindful of the historical precedent of a German delivering Jews up to be killed, she hid the passports instead. The terrorists ultimately turned their wrath upon a U.S. Navy serviceman who also happened to be on the flight, a 23-year-old man from Connecticut named Robert Steedham. The terrorists beat him up, shot him through the head, dumped him out of the plane, and shot him again, even after he was dead. The horror of the Flight 847 ordeal was made real to millions watching on TV, not just through the murder of Steedham, but also this iconic and terrifying image of the plane's captain, Testrake, speaking to reporters through the window of the plane with one of the terrorists' guns to his head. The TWA personnel aboard Flight 847 are the heroes of this story. Not only did the stewardess, Yuli Derrickson, intervene to protect various hostages, but the pilots managed to thwart the terrorist demands to take the plane to Cyprus by faking engine failure once they reached Beirut for the last time. This meant the rest of the hostage drama played out on the ground. It turned out that President Reagan had sent the U.S. Delta Force to Cyprus to storm the plane. If that had happened, quite possibly all the hostages would have been killed. As it turned out, the terrorists themselves, who were joined by more, were split into factions. Once they were on the ground, a group called the Amal Militia, based in Beirut, got involved, and a government official from Lebanon had to broker negotiations between them and Hezbollah to figure out what to do with the hostages. Ultimately, Israel caved and released the 700 prisoners, though the Israeli government insisted, somehow, that this was not what they were doing. The U.S. government, despite Ronald Reagan's public pledges not to negotiate with terrorists, also negotiated with the terrorists, while pretending like they were not negotiating with the terrorists. The remaining hostages were released on June 30th, 1985, with Steedham, the Navy guy, having been the only fatality. The TWA Flight 847 incident, and particularly the image of Captain Testrake with a gun to his head, made a big impression on Ronald Reagan. It was part of the impetus for his administration to begin negotiating with Iran to pressure Hezbollah to release Americans and other Westerners that were being held hostage in Beirut, unrelated to the Flight 847 hostages. That negotiation, of course, led to the Iran-Contra affair, which I made a video about back in 2023. At the same time as the TWA Flight 847 drama was going on, another saga was playing out involving the airline. Earlier in 1985, the price of TWA's stock had fallen below $10 a share, a pretty pitiful performance for a legacy airline. At that low price, corporate raiders were attracted like sharks to a bleeding fish. One of them was this man, Carl Icahn. I'll talk about his background in the next chapter. In the spring of 1985, Icahn started buying large amounts of TWA stock, and by May, the month before the hijacking in Athens, he owned more than 1/5 of the company. Icahn wasn't alone. Guess who came back for a rematch? Frank Lorenzo, the union-busting corporate pirate who had been thwarted once in his attempt to buy the airline. Nearly everybody at TWA was afraid of Carl Icahn. He too seemed allergic to labor unions, but unlike Lorenzo, he had no previous track record in the airline business, and the TWA suits figured that he, Icahn, was planning to buy the airline just to break it up and sell off the assets for a quick buck. With Icahn in the picture, Lorenzo hoped to snatch up TWA as a white knight. That means he would pretend to be the good guy and get TWA's board to encourage the shareholders to sell to him as a means of saving the company from Carl Icahn. On June 13, 1985, the day before the hijacking in Athens, the board accepted Lorenzo's tender offer to acquire a controlling block of the airline at $23 a share, plus preferred stock in Texas Air. The twists and turns of Icahn's battle with Lorenzo are too convoluted to get into on a very fine-grained level. Suffice it to say, TWA's unions, or at least two of them, the pilots and machinists, balked at the thought of selling the airline to the notoriously union-hostile Frank Lorenzo. So they made a sort of a devil's bargain with Carl Icahn. They, the unions, would agree to deep cuts in their wages and benefits, which would free up a bunch of cash and allow Icahn to buy TWA over Lorenzo's head. Essentially, the unions asked themselves, who do we hate more, Frank Lorenzo or Carl Icahn? They decided they hated Lorenzo more. After a contentious series of meetings and brinkmanship throughout the summer, on August 20th, 1985, the TWA board voted to go with Icon's latest deal, which was financed essentially on the backs of the workers who kept the airline flying, and whose wages and benefits were already tenuous. Lorenzo was a little butthurt at being shut out, but he scarfed up $18 million in termination fees from the deal that didn't go through. Carl Icahn was now sitting in the seat Howard Hughes had vacated in 1960. He was the largest shareholder in TWA. The purchase of TWA by Carl Icahn was essentially a financial hijacking. He saw the target, swooped in, played Frank Lorenzo like a fiddle, and kept the unions as hostages to his bottom line. Lorenzo moved on. His next and most high-profile victim was Eastern Airlines, whose plunder he completed in 1991. But the unions, and basically everybody at TWA, would come to regret deeply that they'd invited Icahn in. The story of Icon's acquisition of TWA was very loosely the basis for some of the plot points in Oliver Stone's 1987 film Wall Street. The villain of that piece, Gordon Gekko, played in an Academy Award-winning performance by Michael Douglas, was inspired in part by Carl Icahn. In the film, Gekko buys a small airline called Blue Star and strips it bare in much the same way Icahn did with TWA in real life. Icahn was, however, more of a symptom than a cause of TWA's terminal decline in the 1980s. The real villain was deregulation. As Icahn's battle with Lorenzo shows, if it hadn't been him who bought up TWA, it probably would have been someone else. Be that as it may, that didn't make Icahn's tenure at TWA any less tumultuous, as we will see. The evening after the climactic board meeting that gave him control of TWA Airlines, witnesses said that Carl Icahn put on a TWA pilot's jacket and strutted around his office saying, quote, "We just bought ourselves an airline." If this story is true, there are shades in it of Howard Hughes, who spent much of his career pretending to run a legacy airline without ever really understanding what that meant or how to do it properly. So who was Carl Icahn anyway? He didn't really come out of nowhere, but it might have seemed that way to the public in the mid-1980s. Icahn was one of a new breed of businessman that emerged from the economic and social conditions of that decade. Icahn was born in Brooklyn in 1936 and raised in the Bayswater neighborhood. His family was not wealthy, but solidly middle class. He got good grades and was accepted to Princeton on a full scholarship in 1953, where he studied philosophy. The classism and anti-Semitism directed at a middle-class Brooklyn Jew in an elitist Ivy League school accounts for many of Icahn's tough instincts in business and society. He went to medical school at NYU, but dropped out. He hated the sight of blood and greatly feared catching infectious diseases. He became a stockbroker with Dreyfus Corporation and specialized in options brokering. With an investment from his uncle, Icahn formed his own small brokerage firm in 1968, which, within a couple of years, ran afoul of New York Stock Exchange rules, and Icahn was fined $10,000. He began to adopt an investment strategy. Find bargain basement companies or formerly good companies that had fallen on hard times, buy them, reorganize them, and then sell them at a profit. The companies he targeted were euphemistically called undervalued assets. Tappan, a maker of household appliances, was Icahn's first major score. By buying up large amounts of stock and making veiled threats to take over the company, which Tappan's board of directors didn't want, Icahn drove up the price of the stock and eventually forced the company to sell to a competitor. Icahn himself cashed out with a huge profit. In 1979, he raided Saxon Industries, taking a $2 million payday after more takeover threats. Saxon never recovered and sank into bankruptcy in 1982. As soon as he took over TWA, Icahn sought revenge against the flight attendants union, which was the only one of the three major unions that wouldn't kowtow to him before the purchase. Icahn demanded the flight attendants take huge pay and benefit cuts. He claimed they could afford it because most of them were women and thus not the primary wage earners in their families, as if single mothers or stay-at-home dads did not exist. Sexism was one of the few company traditions that remained intact in the Icahn era. Understandably, the flight attendants gave Carl Icahn the finger. In March 1986, the flight attendants went on strike, but Icahn had already pre-trained a bunch of secretaries and other employees to step in as scabs during the strike. Each scab cost him only $1,000 a day, far less than union flight attendants did. The head of the TWA flight attendants union, Vicky Frankovich, set herself up as Icahn's nemesis, but the scabs meant that the airline could continue to fly. Eventually, she gave up and ordered her union members to go back to work, even though there was no agreement. Only some of them actually got their jobs back. Most of the scabs Icahn had hired remained as flight attendants. In simpler terms, he had essentially de-unionized TWA's flight attendants and humiliated the union ones in the process. The next target was Ozark Airlines, which, as you remember, was TWA's main competitor at the St. Louis hub. In September 1986, TWA absorbed Ozark in a merger, which meant TWA would have what's called in the airline business a fortress hub in St. Louis. But the Ozark merger brought chaos to TWA. Icahn laid off nearly 20% of Ozark's pilots and threatened to fire the rest unless they agreed to his terms, which in many cases cut off their seniority. Furthermore, Icahn canceled the pension plan for Ozark's employees and forced them to join TWA's retirement plans, which were inadequate and underfunded. Icahn made $35 million on that deal alone. Remember the inadequate pension fund. It becomes important later. As if that wasn't enough, he immediately sold all of Ozark's DC-9 jets to another company he owned for $200 million. He leased those jets back to TWA, which burdened the airline with more debt. Technically, TWA showed millions of dollars in profits, which allowed Icahn to trumpet to the press that he had turned the airline around. In reality, the profits were mostly paper and cloaked hundreds of millions of dollars more in debts that he had racked up. And now that TWA assets like routes and planes were essentially his toys to play with, he could sell them piece by piece and pocket the money. The final indignity and the true beginning of the end for the airline was a deal to privatize TWA. Icahn now owned 3/4 of the airline's stock, but he wanted the rest. In a deal ratified in September 1988, TWA's remaining shareholders sold their shares to a company controlled by Icahn, with 10% of the stock remaining in an employee stock option plan. The deal, worth over $600 million, was financed with junk bonds that turned out to be mostly worthless. I know I've been throwing around a lot of financial and Wall Street jargon, but what this basically all means is that through various deals, Icahn managed to transfer everything of value that TWA once had, such as its stock, into his own hands, while saddling the company with $1 billion of debt that he, Icahn, was not on the hook for. In some cases, the assets he scarfed up were the pensions of people, pilots, flight attendants, mechanics, and everyone else who had worked for TWA for years. He got richer off the work they had been doing long before he ever got on the scene. The employees of TWA hated and resented Carl Icahn. After the privatization deal, graffiti disparaging him started to appear on the walls of hangars or even in crew spaces aboard airplanes. Not only was Icahn stealing from the employees, but he had no idea how to run an airline. On one occasion, he told the unions that he and TWA's board had a great new plan to boost the airline's profitability, a major capital expenditure. Know what it turned out to be? New vacuum cleaners for the crews cleaning the planes. That was it. And it wasn't just double talk. He and the board really believed new vacuum cleaners were going to make the difference in TWA's fortunes. Icahn basically lived in a fantasy world. The airline was hemorrhaging money. In late 1990 and early 1991, the Persian Gulf War, subject of another video I did, depressed demand for air travel across the board. TWA started defaulting on its debt obligations, which by this point totaled $400 million. Icahn demanded still more wage and benefit concessions from TWA's pilots, but this time they refused. Desperate for cash, Icahn started selling off TWA's most lucrative international routes, including routes to London, to American Airlines. The real problem, though, was the pension plan. Remember I said it was underfunded, which meant there wasn't enough money in it to cover all the pensions promised to TWA's employees. If Icahn plunged TWA into bankruptcy and got out, the shortfall in the pensions would pass to something called the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, a federal entity. In other words, the U.S. taxpayers would pay the remainder of TWA's employees' pensions, and Icahn would slip away to go count his millions. Realizing this was what he was planning to do, Congress passed bills preventing the pension obligation from passing to the taxpayers so long as Carl Icahn still had significant assets. TWA officially went into Chapter 11 bankruptcy on January 31st, 1992. But now, because of that congressional act, the Federal Pension Guarantee Fund was now one of the creditors who would be in on the negotiations for how TWA would be restructured, if it could emerge from bankruptcy at all. As much as he wanted to, Icahn couldn't quite wiggle out of this one. After nearly a year of negotiations, which included the federal government, bankruptcy courts, all the unions, and Congressman Richard Gephardt, Icahn signed a deal on December 6, 1992. He would lend $200 million to TWA and give it $20 million a year for its pension funds. But the unions were forced to make more wage and benefit concessions. On January 4, 1993, Carl Icahn resigned as a member of the board of TWA. His reign of terror was mostly, though not quite completely, over. It was pretty much too late. TWA emerged from bankruptcy in November 1993, but it still owed almost $2 billion in debt and was losing money hand over fist. TWA had been a cut-rate airline in financial and operational turmoil for so many years that the public had a generally unfavorable view of it, and morale was low among its employees, despite many of them having worked there diligently for decades. Carl Icahn had sucked the very life out of one of America's legacy airlines. Unable to pay its debts, incredibly, TWA went into Chapter 11 bankruptcy a second time in June 1995. Just so you know, Chapter 11 bankruptcy is not a permanent termination of the company. It's not like going bankrupt in Monopoly when you simply lose the game. It was a court-supervised restructuring, shifting around assets and obligations, with almost all stakeholders taking something of a haircut in order to keep the business afloat. The second bankruptcy was only marginally more successful. In 1995, TWA only lost $227 million, slightly better than the $435 million it lost in 1994. In early 1996, TWA was balanced on a knife edge. It was possible that its worst days were behind it, and though the road ahead would be rocky no matter what happened, it might, just might, have the wherewithal to survive. Or it could slip even farther into the abyss. At this precarious moment in its history, TWA suffered the most high-profile disaster in its entire existence. On July 17, 1996, a TWA 747 left New York's JFK Airport at shortly after 8 p.m., headed for Paris. There were 230 people on board. The passengers included Jed Johnson, who was Andy Warhol's ex-boyfriend, German fashion photographer Rico Pullman, and 16 students from the French Club of Montoursville Area High School near Williamsport, Pennsylvania. Earlier that day, the 747-100 aircraft, technically classified 747-131, had flown in from Athens, Greece as TWA Flight 881. The plane was one of the older ones in TWA's fleet, having been delivered to the airline in 1971. Incidentally, this plane was the self-same one that appears in this shot from the 1980 comedy movie 9 to 5. 12 minutes after takeoff, TWA Flight 800 blew up fell out of the sky and sank into the ocean about 9.5 miles from the southern shore of Long Island. East Moriches was the nearest sizable town. There were no survivors. Horribly, flotsam from the plane, including charred shoes, washed up along Long Island beaches weeks after the disaster. At the site where the plane sank, all sorts of debris was found. Seat cushions, suitcases, a bag of mail, even a Mickey Mouse doll that had belonged to a child on board. It was the worst disaster in the airline's history, and one of the deadliest crashes in U.S. aviation history up until that time. I remember when it happened. The whole country was stunned and in mourning. The disaster hit TWA very hard. Many employees knew somebody aboard the flight, and numerous family members of TWA employees were among the dead. For people within the TWA company, it was a family tragedy. Although this was 5 years before 9/11, terrorism was suspected almost immediately in the TWA 800 crash. After all, planes just don't explode spontaneously in midair, right? At first glance, the disaster resembled the loss of Pan Am Flight 103 in December 1988, which was destroyed by a bomb. Both the National Transportation Safety Board, which routinely investigates plane crashes, and the FBI opened concurrent investigations into TWA 800. At first, there seemed to be some basis for the suspicion that TWA 800 was blown up or shot down. A significant number of witnesses to the crash reported seeing something they described as a streak of light associated with the event, and many also described a fireball consuming the plane before it fell. Was the streak of light a missile of some kind? A few months after the crash, Pierre Salinger, who had been White House press secretary in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, gave a press interview in France, where he lived, in which he touted what he claimed was proof that TWA 800 was brought down by a missile. He said it had been given to him by an intelligence agent. It wasn't. What it actually turned out to be was an email forwarded to him by a former United Airlines pilot, pushing a missile theory that had, at the time Salinger latched onto it, already been debunked. 1996 was the early days of the internet, and the incident resulted in the unfortunate coining of the term Pierre Salinger syndrome, the belief that everything you read on the internet is true. Long story short, after an exhaustive investigation lasting 5 years, and which involved virtually the complete reconstruction of blown-up pieces of the 747 recovered from the ocean floor, the NTSB concluded that the plane was brought down by an explosion of a flammable mixture of air and residual jet fuel in the 747's center wing fuel tank. Though they couldn't specifically identify the ignition source, it could have been one of several things, including deteriorated wiring. The evidence for this conclusion, unlikely though it seemed at first blush, was actually very strong. Furthermore, the FBI and even the CIA, which also took part in the investigation, found no evidence of foul play. The purpose of this video is not to debunk all of the numerous TWA Flight 800 conspiracy theories that still persist 30 years after the event. I could spend 2.5 hours on that alone, but I really don't want to. However, it is worth going through, briefly, the reasons why investigators concluded that the center fuel tank explosion and not terrorism or a missile was the cause of the crash. And yes, I will address the streak of light thing in due course. The NTSB carefully reconstructed the sequence of events aboard the plane. The earliest sign of trouble, before anything else happened, was a strange recording on the cockpit voice recorder. 2 minutes before the crash, the captain, Ralph Kevorkian, a 31-year veteran of TWA, said, quote, "Look at that crazy fuel flow indicator on number 4. See that?" End quote. So it's reasonable to assume that something was going wrong with the plane that indicated on the fuel gauges. No explosion or strike or anything of that nature had occurred at that point in the flight. The bodies of the crash victims were examined by personnel from the U.S. Air Force, the U.S. Army, the NTSB, and Suffolk County Police Department. None showed localized areas of damage or injuries, which they would have if a bomb went off or a missile struck the plane. Indeed, all the injuries they found were entirely consistent with the plane breaking up in flight and then the wreckage striking the water below. All radar data in the area was carefully examined. There were no radar blips found in the air or on the water that intersected the flight path of TWA 800 at any time, and also no radar returns at all, consistent with a missile being fired at the plane. The investigators looked hard for evidence of a missile impact or bomb explosion. If either of those had happened, you would see penetration of the plane's skin by small, high-velocity fragments. When reconstructing the plane, investigators found 196 small holes in various pieces of wreckage. Of those 196, they found all but 25 were definitely low-velocity impacts. Of the remaining 25, 23 had some characteristics of low-velocity impacts. The remaining two, the only two holes that could possibly have been made by high-velocity penetrations, were not made by particles deriving from a common point, and they did not come from inside the plane. In other words, they were probably also low-velocity penetrations. If it was either a missile or a bomb, you would have had high-velocity holes all over the place, and they would have come from a common point. That was clearly not the case here. The physical evidence, exhaustively analyzed, was totally inconsistent with the results of a missile or a bomb. But could that kind of damage have been on the pieces of wreckage that the investigators didn't recover? No. A report by the Naval Air Warfare Center Weapons Division, totally separate from the NTSB or FBI, concluded, quote, with approximately 95% of TWA Flight 800 recovered, fragment-damaged pieces of the aircraft should be present in the debris if a shoulder-launched missile warhead had detonated within or just outside the aircraft. There are no areas of missing material on the wreckage large enough to contain this amount of damage. End quote. Furthermore, if it was either of those, a bomb or a missile, there would have been large amounts of traces of explosive residue on the wreckage. The investigators found only very tiny amounts of explosive residue on some pieces from inside the plane, which they determined had gotten there because the aircraft had been used about a month before in an exercise to train dogs to sniff out explosives. They were not in anything close to the quantities you would see if either a bomb or a missile had been used to destroy TWA Flight 800. Thus, no physical evidence of a bomb or missile. So what about that highly unlikely spontaneous fuel tank explosion? Well, turns out it was not highly unlikely at all, and it was not spontaneous. There were about 300 pounds of fuel in the center wing tank at the time TWA 800 took off. 300 pounds in a tank built for over 86,000 pounds. When they refueled at JFK, they did not fill this center tank. This meant that it had a mixture of mostly air and a small amount of fuel. It was a warm evening, after all, it was mid-July. Through computer modeling and physical experiments, investigators found that the flash point of the fuel-air mixture that would have been in the center tank at the time was quite low, only 114 degrees Fahrenheit or 45.5 degrees Celsius. Even more, they found that ignition can occur at temperatures below the flash point temperature, so it didn't even have to get that hot. Using a 1/4 scale model of the center tank under conditions they determined were present at the time, the fuel-air ratio and the temperature, investigators found, quote, Jet A fuel ignited and combusted during every test using conditions approximating those that existed in the accident airplane's CWT at the time of the accident, end quote. In other words, once they figured out what the conditions were in the tank, it blew every single time they simulated it. And the computer models agreed. Oh, but that's only a 1/4 scale model in a computer, right? Well, in 1997, the investigators tried it on a full scale, out of service 747 at an airfield in Leicestershire, England. When they blew the center tank, the plane disintegrated exactly as they surmised TWA 800 had fallen apart in midair, and it produced debris with the same characteristics. Well, what was the ignition source? Well, it could have been a lot of things, and the NTSB did extensive tests with arcing, exposed wires, aged wires, and also around leaked fuel, lavatory fluids, metal shavings, that sort of thing. They found significant potential for ignitions. They even checked with astronomers to investigate the remote possibility that TWA 800 had been hit by a meteorite. And far from being an unprecedented freak accident, since 1959, there were 25 documented cases of fuel tank explosions in aircraft that resembled this case. In May 1976, an Iranian Air Force 747-131, exactly the same type of aircraft as TWA 800, blew up in Spain, killing 17 people. One of the fuel tanks blew after a small lightning strike. In Manila, Philippines, in May 1990, a Philippine Airline 737 blew up from its center tank, sending 8 people to the morgue. No specific ignition source was identified, as in the TWA 800 case. So, in other words, this exact kind of accident had happened before at least 25 times, and once the investigators figured out what the conditions actually were in the center fuel tank, they replicated the explosion every single time they tried it. Pretty strong evidence that this is in fact what had happened. But what about those witnesses? That streak of light stuff sounds pretty fishy, doesn't it? Well, the witness accounts were investigated by 3 different agencies. Of 736 witnesses who were around Long Island that day, whether on land, on the water, or in the air, 599, or 81.4%, reported seeing a fireball. 258, or 35%, reported seeing a streak of light or some variation of it. However, only 38 of those witnesses, 14.7% of the streak of light witnesses, and 5.2% of all witnesses, claimed that they saw the streak of light ascending into the sky. The vast majority of people saw it moving horizontally or down. Many described it as looking like a shooting star. This was before the fireball erupted. To test the witness accounts, on April 28, 2000, the NTSB investigators test-fired shoulder-launched missiles from Elgin Air Force Base at Fort Walton Beach, Florida, with numerous observers positioned between 4.5 to 11 nautical miles from the crash site. That's where they figured a shoulder-launched missile would have had to have been fired from. The test witnesses' reports were considerably different than what all of the streak of light witnesses who saw TWA 800 reported, including the 38 who said they saw an ascending streak of light, which, as you recall, was only 5.2% of the total witnesses. Furthermore, for a missile to have been fired at TWA 800, it would have had to have been fired between 41 and 49 seconds before the fireball developed. However, no one, not a single witness, said they saw a streak of light that long before they saw the fireball. Therefore, whatever they thought they saw, it absolutely could not have been a missile. The Fort Walton Beach test proved this beyond all doubt. The NTSB also noted significant problems with the witness statements. There were major inconsistencies, some changed their stories over multiple interviews, and some were contaminated by the questioners, many of whom in the early days were specifically investigating a potential terrorism connection, and witnesses knew that at the time. So let's combine this with the Naval Air Weapons Center's conclusions from their report I mentioned a minute ago. After studying the wreckage and all the data, they said, quote, "No conclusive evidence of missile impacts exists on any of the recovered wreckage of TWA Flight 800. No evidence of high-velocity fragment impacts exists, which indicates a live warhead did not detonate within or near the exterior of the aircraft. The possibility that a shoulder-launched missile was launched at TWA Flight 800, failed to intercept it, self-destructed in close proximity, and initiated the breakup of the aircraft is highly improbable," end quote. Because the missile visibility tests proved that the witness statements were incompatible with what they would have seen if a missile had been launched at TWA 800, and because all the independent investigative bodies found there was no physical evidence of a missile detonation or a bomb for that matter, and because of the consistency of the simulations done to replicate the center fuel tank explosion, all the evidence is extremely convincing that TWA 800 was not brought down by a missile or a bomb. It was the center fuel tank, folks. It just was. So what did those witnesses see, if not a missile, particularly those streak of light witnesses? What they were looking at was the 747 streaking through the sky as the fuel tank started to blow, the shooting star effect. Then the fireball as the whole plane broke up from the explosion. Since all the witnesses who saw a streak of light saw it very close in time proximity to the fireball, they were clearly all seeing some portion of the breakup of the plane as it descended, not 41 to 49 seconds later, as would had to have been the case if they were watching the plane get destroyed by a missile. Put this all together with a glaring lack of documentary or circumstantial evidence of terrorism or something else. Conspiracy theories about the U.S. Navy shooting down TWA 800, either accidentally or on purpose, are clearly wrong. The nearest Navy ships were much too far away, and in any event, we can rule out a missile strike entirely from other evidence. So it wasn't an accidental or intentional shootdown. If it was terrorism, what group did it? How come there was no claim of responsibility? Before you point the finger at Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden's group, we have extensive documentary evidence of what Al-Qaeda was up to in 1996, and they were not operating in the United States or targeting American civilians in the U.S. at that time. Indeed, bin Laden had just arrived in Afghanistan in mid-1996 after having been kicked out of Sudan. There isn't a shred of evidence connecting Al-Qaeda to TWA 800. I cover the history of Al-Qaeda extensively in the class on my website about the origins of September 11th, if you're interested in that. If TWA 800 was a terrorist attack, who did it? In 30 years, no evidence has come to light linking it to any terrorist group anywhere. And in any event, as we've proven, it could not have been a bomb or a missile strike. You're basically out of options on how any terrorist could realistically have done it. So it was not a terrorist attack. It was not shot down by the U.S. military or anyone else, accidentally or deliberately. Those possibilities were conclusively eliminated. The TWA 800 disaster was a tragic accident. It was caused by an explosion of air and fuel in the center fuel tank, an accident for which there is abundant scientific and forensic evidence, as well as considerable historic precedent. It was not shot down. It was not a conspiracy. It was not a cover-up. You can read the documents themselves, the NTSB and Naval Air Weapons Center reports for yourself. If you don't believe me, they are linked in the description to this video. Flight 800, coming as it did at that critical knife-edge moment in TWA's history, did not cause the airline's final collapse, but it may have made it all the more inevitable. Travelers stayed away from the airline in the wake of Flight 800, thus making it impossible to stop the bleeding of earnings and revenue. We'll cover the story of the airline's final decline from 1996 to its disappearance 5 years later in the next chapter. By the late 1990s, TWA was a pale shadow of its former self. The airline was still flying, but it was kind of limping along on a wing and a prayer. The company lost $284 million in 1996 alone, and it had been in Chapter 11 bankruptcy twice in the previous 5 years. The glory days were definitely gone. I actually flew on TWA during this period. I don't remember exactly, but it had to have been in 1999 or 2000. They got me to where I was going, but I recall the plane was old and dirty, the service was lackluster, the bathrooms stank, the food was terrible, and the flight attendants seemed weary and demoralized. TWA's St. Louis terminal was perhaps the most depressing airport concourse in America. Gone were the days when Frank Sinatra and Princess Grace proudly came down the jetways and sparkling new planes blazed trails into the future above the TWA Flight Center in New York. TWA had a new chairman beginning in 1997. Gary Gittner had worked at TWA in the 60s and 70s and then worked for Frank Lorenzo, a bad sign, at Texas Air in the 80s. He was a staunch acolyte of the gospel of deregulation. To be sure, he was balanced by Bill Compton, a former pilot and union representative, as president and chief operations officer, after Gittner provoked yet another fight with the unions. Gittner and Compton pretty much ran TWA jointly until 1999, when Gittner quit and Compton took over his roles. They tried some strategies, such as retiring some of TWA's old planes and replacing them with newer Boeing 757 and 767 models. They also dropped some old money-losing routes. Within a few years, TWA was almost exclusively a domestic carrier again, with only 2% of its flights to overseas destinations. Passenger traffic was increasing at St. Louis, but regulatory struggles over expanding the airport there constrained TWA's ability to grow. The deck was stacked against it. Incredibly, although he was no longer in charge, Carl Icahn was still out there and still causing problems. As part of the 1995 Chapter 11 restructuring, Icahn had lent TWA a bunch of money in exchange for a deal where a company controlled by him called Caribou Corporation could buy an unlimited number of tickets on TWA for 45% less than their official fares. Icahn formed a travel agency company, Global Discount Travel Services, to sell these tickets to the public, mostly on the internet. The Caribou deal was simply another way to loot TWA. Because of that 45% discount, Icahn's travel agency could undercut TWA's own fares on TWA-run flights. I have no way of knowing now, but when I traveled on TWA during that period, I may well have bought my ticket as part of this Caribou scheme. By the turn of the century, the Caribou deal was costing TWA $100 million a year, contributing to its horrendous losses. I find the Caribou deal fascinating because it demonstrates how out of step TWA was with the modern world. This legacy airline, flying since 1930 and its predecessor since earlier than that, had successfully developed in tandem with the new industry of commercial aviation. 70 years later, cash-strapped and struggling to keep the doors open, it was getting killed in petty fare wars on the internet, which, if it had better and more visionary leadership, it might have been able to leverage. A 20th century airline was really unprepared to exist in a 21st century world. TWA was just from another time. The impetus for the end of TWA was a loan for $100 million that was coming due on January 15th, 2001. The company didn't have the cash to pay it off, and they couldn't renegotiate it. As this crisis loomed, Carl Icahn stuck the knife in yet again by terminating 2 of the TWA pension funds that he'd previously agreed back in 1992 to keep going. If you're wondering why that was legal, there was, after all, that act of Congress. It's because there was apparently a sunset provision on Icahn's obligation to fund the pensions. The taxpayers would bail out TWA's pension holders after all. On January 10th, 2001, TWA announced a hasty deal it had made to sell what was left of itself to American Airlines. There was simply no other choice. On that day, January 10th, TWA had only $20 million in the bank and literally couldn't afford to keep operating for even one more day. To avoid a catastrophic and humiliating shutdown like what had happened to Pan Am in December 1991, American Airlines got a cheap deal. TWA's assets, including planes, routes, and infrastructure, went to American Airlines for the fairly paltry sum of $300 million. American agreed to take on TWA's employees, but to make the deal work, TWA had to go into Chapter 11 bankruptcy restructuring again. And, running true to form, Carl Icahn tried to spoil the deal. Again. At the last minute, he offered to save, in quotes, the airline for $1.1 billion if the pilots and machinists unions would help fund the deal by taking steep pay and benefit cuts. To the very end, Carl Icahn kept trying to rob TWA's employees and crush its unions. This time, though, it didn't work. A bankruptcy judge characterized Icahn's plan as a joke, direct quote, and stopped it in its tracks. The court-approved merger agreement between American and TWA went into effect on April 9th, 2001. Though it was being absorbed into American Airlines, TWA planes were still sometimes seen in the skies and at airports, especially St. Louis, during the rest of the year 2001. There was more mishigas involving the unions and the perennially thorny issue of how former TWA pilots' seniority status would be treated within the American Airlines system. But then, of course, this happened. 2 of the planes involved belonged to American, and the whole air travel system slumped precipitously in the aftermath. Even if TWA hadn't been forced to sell to American before 9/11, there's simply no way it could have survived afterwards. What had once been the airline of Charles Lindbergh and Howard Hughes barely made it alive into the internet era. It couldn't have existed post 9/11, and indeed it didn't. On December 1st, 2001, Bill Compton, TWA's former CEO and still a licensed pilot, flew the very last passenger flight in the airline's history, from Kansas City to St. Louis. It was the last landing. Some of the airline's assets survived and went into the American system. There were still contract and labor disputes involving TWA that went on beyond 2001. Many of TWA's former employees continued to work for American. Some perhaps do to this day. But Trans World Airlines itself, the red and white alter ego to Pan American's white and blue, one of the most famous airlines of its era, was now a part of history. It ended not with a bang, and not even really a whimper, but some paper shuffling around in court records and lawyers' offices, with some planes being repainted and some airport infrastructure, most of it in St. Louis, getting remodeled. This was the end of an era. Flight attendants, arm doors for arrival. I hope you've enjoyed your flight. Here's what happened to some of the major players in our story and the resolution of a few loose ends. Charles Lindbergh never had any significant relationship with TWA after they dumped him in the aftermath of Kristallnacht. Lindbergh's pro-Nazi sympathies and his ardent isolationism in the early World War II years cast a long shadow over his later career and legacy. He worked sometime as a consultant for Pan Am, sometime on his own. He never lost his affinity for Germany. In the post-World War II years, he fathered several children, with 3 different mistresses in Germany, a fact that was not proven beyond doubt until DNA tests emerged in this century. Lindbergh later relocated to Hawaii. He died there in August 1974 of lymphoma. Since his death, the heroic treatment that surrounded his famous 1927 flight has been contrasted against his unsavory political and racial ideas and the less than flattering revelations about his personal life. If he had only refused that certificate from Hitler, history might have treated him a little better. Jack Fry, the former TWA president and pilot who quit the airline after a dispute with Howard Hughes in early 1947, found a second career administering German companies seized by the U.S. government during World War II. Despite his differences with Hughes, however, their relationship wasn't acrimonious, and Hughes was in fact involved in Fry's plans to develop revolutionary new planes. Fry had formed his own company, Fry Corporation, in the mid-1950s to do this kind of work. Unfortunately, he never got the chance. On February 3rd, 1959, in Tucson, Arizona, Fry was involved in a car crash with a drunk driver. He died instantly. He was 54. Coincidentally, he was killed on the same day as the famous plane crash that killed Buddy Holly and Richie Valens. Noah Dietrich, Howard Hughes' right-hand man who effectively ran TWA, or at least pulled the strings on his boss's behalf, quit the Hughes Enterprises abruptly in early 1957. Hughes was so obsessive that he never let Dietrich take any time off, and the dispute that brought matters to a head was evidently an African safari that Dietrich was determined to take, his first vacation in years. Hughes tried some chicanery to interfere with that, and Dietrich finally had enough. In the early 1970s, while quietly serving on other boards and conducting various businesses, Dietrich wrote a memoir of his years with Hughes, which I read in research on this project. Someone else who read it was Clifford Irving, the fraudulent biographer who ginned up and sold a fake autobiography of Howard Hughes in 1972, based in part on Dietrich's genuine memoir. The story of Irving's spectacular forgery is told in Orson Welles' quirky documentary film F for Fake. Dietrich himself retired and led a quiet life. He died in Palm Springs in 1982. Hughes himself had an unhappy life after his breakdown in 1947. He was a prisoner of his mental illnesses that seemed to get worse over time. He was also physically ill, in part due to lingering effects of injuries sustained in his various plane crashes, and he was addicted to drugs for his chronic pain. Hughes eventually lived in various Las Vegas hotel penthouses, including famously the Desert Inn, which he bought suddenly because the owners were about to evict him. Reluctant to seek medical attention, Hughes, now living in Acapulco, became so sick that he finally allowed his handlers to try to take him back to the U.S., specifically Houston, for treatment. He didn't make it. On April 5, 1976, Howard Hughes died aboard a plane. A later investigation suggested he was possibly murdered by one of his aides with a drug injection, maybe a form of euthanasia, maybe not. He wasn't going to live much longer anyway, suffering from advanced kidney failure, and he weighed 90 pounds at the time of his death. The autopsy found several broken-off hypodermic syringe needles stuck into various parts of Hughes's body. He was buried in Houston. The famous story that he left part of his estate to a gas station owner that did Hughes a good deed back in 1967 was found to be a fabrication. Remember that lawsuit that TWA filed against Hughes in the 1960s, alleging his interference with their operations? Well, it was still working its way through the courts long after Hughes's death. In 1988, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld a $48 million judgment against the Hughes estate in favor of TWA. This cash, ironically, was absorbed by Carl Icahn, who used it to cloak what would otherwise have been TWA's operating losses at that time, when Icahn was claiming falsely that he had turned around the airline's fortunes. Forwood C. Weiser, known as Bud Weiser, yeah, I can't get over that, recovered from his nervous breakdown in 1975 and went right back to work in the airline business. He became president of Pan Am, TWA's arch rival, and served 2 years in what must have been another thankless, high-stress job. He served on various other corporate boards during his long career. On November 23, 1987, he died of Alzheimer's disease in a New Jersey nursing home. Frank Lorenzo, the bane of airline unions' existences, is still alive. His attempts to hijack TWA were merely part and parcel of the long path of destruction he carved through the entire airline industry in the 1970s and 80s. After his follies with TWA, he was invited into Eastern Airlines by its president, former Apollo 8 astronaut Frank Borman. The relationship was disastrous. Lorenzo pursued the same sort of asset-stripping, labor-crushing behavior at Eastern as Carl Icahn was doing at TWA. Eastern was unable to withstand the onslaught and crumbled into dust in 1991. I may do a video about that. Lorenzo also had a hand in the declines of Continental Airlines and Frontier Airlines. When his rampage through the U.S. airline business ended in 1990, Lorenzo mostly turned to high finance, and he made another fortune. He now supports several philanthropic organizations, such as the Hispanic Society of America. Carl Icahn is also still alive, and his career of corporate piracy has continued largely unabated since his hasty exit from TWA in 1993. The list of companies he's been involved in is way too long to go into here, but they include Marvel Comics, Motorola, which he failed to take over, Yahoo, Netflix, Apple, Lyft, various Las Vegas casinos, and McDonald's. He's had some involvement with the Donald Trump administrations and was at one time put forward as a possible nominee for Secretary of the Treasury in Trump's first term, though that didn't end up happening. Icahn's name appears 421 times in the recently released Epstein Papers database. If you want to research the context of Icahn's appearance in those documents, have at it. You can find them on the Justice Department website. On the positive side, Icahn has been very active in various philanthropic projects, including funding a genomics laboratory at Princeton University, his alma mater, and several shelters for homeless families in the New York City area. TWA was one of America's great legacy airlines. With the exception of Pan Am, which is primarily an international carrier, no other U.S. airline is more closely identified with the golden age of air travel. TWA was historic in that it emerged from the most basic roots of aviation as an industry and a phenomenon, and it was a major part of how flying itself became normalized as something ordinary people could do and did. It should be remembered as an important part of American history in the 20th century. But on the other hand, TWA was, for much of its existence, never really allowed to do or be what it could have been or could have accomplished. For a pioneering airline that should have been on the cutting edge, too often TWA was behind the curve, late to the game, or held back from its full potential by one thing or another. In the 1930s and 40s, and again in the 1980s, business conditions allowed TWA to become a plaything of clueless amateurs, Howard Hughes and Carl Icahn, who didn't really understand what they were doing or what TWA could have and should have been. And there was bad luck, such bad luck. From that crash near Albuquerque in 1929, to the horrific accident that killed Carol Lombard, and to the ordeals and tragedies of flights 847, 800, and various others, TWA never strayed very far from the dark side. You can remember TWA as a positive force, or a source of nostalgia and fond memories, as many of its former employees and passengers do. I'm sure I'll hear from some of them, probably a lot of them, in the comments to this video. But there is also a lot of sorrow, rage, frustration, and disappointment in the TWA story as well. It's kind of hard to get your head around everything TWA is and was. I've made an attempt in this video. All I can say for sure, at its end, is that it's a very complicated legacy. If you liked this video, please hit the like button, share it, do all the stuff that you normally do for a video you like. You can join the members section on my YouTube channel for $5 a month. There you'll find an ad-free version of this video with some very slight differences and no redactions. The sources I used to make this video are listed in credits in the end and also down below in the description. Please do check them out. There's some really great stuff there. As usual, I want to say that no part of this video, including the research or writing of the script, was done with AI. I write books, novels mostly, and you can find them on Amazon Kindle. And there are also paperback versions available. I wrote a mystery called Daniel Vanished, an international crime thriller called In Deadly Mirrors, and my favorite of my books, a weird magical realism time travel fantasy called The Valley of Forever. A link to my Amazon page is in the description. I teach history classes online at my website, seanmunger.com, and you can sign up for my blog at gardenofmemory.net and get these columns delivered directly to your email. On that blog at the paid tier, I write articles that go behind the scenes of the making of these videos and my thoughts on them, if you're interested. Thank you to all my fans and supporters, and thank you once again for joining me on another journey into the past.